Hello and welcome to my talk on normative quasi-naturalism and its virtues. In this talk I will give an overview of the research project that I am working on, and more specifically I will summarize the arguments in two papers that are part of this project. Like most metaethicists, I have my own wish list for the right metaethical theory. First, it should secure normative truth and objectivity. So it should make good on the idea that there are objective normative facts and that many of our beliefs about these facts are true. Secondly, it should explain the fact that making a normative judgment involves having certain motivations to act, at least in normal circumstances. It should also explain the supervenience of normative facts on non-normative facts, which is, broadly speaking, the principle that there can be no difference in normative facts without a difference in the underlying non-normative facts. It should abide by a principle of metaphysical parsimony, so it shouldn't posit any unnecessary entities. It should do justice to the intuitions behind various arguments against naturalism, like G. Moore's open question argument or the just too different argument made by David Enoch and others. The open question argument is the idea that for any purported definition of goodness or of other normative properties in purely naturalistic terms, it is always intelligible to ask whether something that has relevant natural properties is actually good or right, and so on. The just too different argument amounts basically to the claim that normative facts and natural facts are just too different for naturalism to be true. Even if you think these arguments fail, and I think they do fail, at least when it comes to certain versions of naturalism, I think we still need to say something about why people have the intuitions that drive these arguments. And finally, two more items, on which I'll spend most of my time in this presentation. The right metaethical view should have good responses to epistemological challenges and to metasemantic challenges. And I'll say more about what kind of challenges I have in mind in a few minutes. Now let me quickly go over views that I believe are immediately ruled out by this wish list. Just looking at the first item on the list, truth and objectivity, we can rule out traditional non-cognitivism or emotivism, on which normative claims are not truth-apt, error theory, which says our normative beliefs are false, and also subjectivism, relativism, and constructivism, because they do not secure normative objectivity. And I also believe that Moore's open question argument conclusively rules out analytic naturalism, the view that normative concepts can be defined in purely descriptive or naturalistic terms. So here are then what I see as the main contenders for the right metaethical view. First, non-analytic naturalist realism. This is the view that normative properties are identical with or reducible to natural properties, but normative concepts are not definable in naturalistic terms. Then there's non-naturalist realism, according to which there are sui generis normative properties irreducible to natural properties. And I include here both robust metaphysical versions of non-naturalism, like the views defended by Rafe Wedgwood or David Enoch, and minimal or relaxed varieties of non-naturalism, like Tim Scanlon's or Ronald Dworkin's views, on which realist theses are understood as internal to normative discourse, by relying on a deflationary account of truth, facts, and other related notions. And finally, there is the expressivist quasi-realism defended most prominently by Simon Blackburn and Alan Gibbard. To be clear, I'm not denying that these views still face most of the problems on my list, but I don't think that they are obviously destined to fail. There's at least some hope that they'll be able to address all of these problems. Now let me introduce a specific version of quasi-realism that I call quasi-naturalism. Quasi-realism is not usually placed on the naturalist-non-naturalist axis, perhaps because most people don't see it as a version of genuine realism. But Alan Gibbard has a very interesting discussion of what he calls natural constitution in his book Thinking How to Live, which suggests that quasi-realism is best understood as a form of naturalism about normativity. And this is the view that I think has the best chance of meeting all the criteria on the wish list. But before I talk about its virtues, let me define quasi-naturalism more precisely. It has three main ingredients. First, expressivism. This is, broadly speaking, the view that normative claims express desire-like mental states. Now, this can be understood either as a program in first-order semantics or as a metasemantic account of why normative claims have the meanings that they do. but I'll set aside this question about how expressivism is best understood, at least for the purposes of this talk. Secondly, this view relies on a deflationary account of the metaphysical and semantic notions in terms of which realism is usually stated, like truth, fact, property, or description. On this account, for instance, to say that it is true that genocide is wrong or that it is a fact that genocide is wrong amounts to nothing more than saying that genocide is wrong. So deflationism allows expressivists to endorse many of the claims that realists make, like talking about the existence of normative facts and properties. And finally, this view proposes a naturalist metaphysics of normativity. Normative properties are identical with, or at least fully constituted by, natural properties. For instance, goodness is nothing over and above the cluster of natural properties on which it supervenes, the precise composition of which is to be determined through normative inquiry. And more generally, the quasi-naturalist claims about property identity or constitution should be understood as normative claims, rather than as purely metaphysical theses external to normative discourse. Now, before I talk about how this view addresses certain epistemological and metasemantic challenges to realism, let me quickly go over how it meets the other criteria on my list. First, truth and objectivity. Quasi-realists will endorse claims like it is an objective truth or an objective fact that genocide is wrong. They are able to do so by relying on their deflationism about truth and facts, and by giving an expressivist account of the attitudes expressed by objectivity claims. On this account, claims about objectivity express a certain kind of resilient attitude, like an attitude of disapproving of genocide even when considering scenarios in which we ourselves had different attitudes toward genocide. Secondly, expressivism has a clear advantage when it comes to explaining the motivational force of normative judgments, given the central role it gives to desire-like attitudes in its psychological picture of normative thought. Quasi-naturalism also easily explains supervenience, simply in virtue of reducing normative properties to non-normative properties. The view is also ontologically parsimonious for the same reason. Fundamentally, it only relies on the existence of natural properties and our attitudes towards those properties. And quasi-naturalism can also explain away the intuitions behind the open question argument and the just so different argument, and behind other similar arguments against naturalism, by appealing to the distinctive function of normative concepts. According to expressivism, normative concepts have the function to help convey our desire-like attitudes and to guide our actions, unlike purely naturalistic concepts. And this difference in function helps explain the open field of questions like, is this or that natural property good? And also the intuition that normative facts are fundamentally different from natural facts. This intuition as such is misguided, quasi-naturalists will say, because normative facts are ultimately just natural facts. But it is at the same time an understandable intuition, given that normative concepts and naturalistic concepts play different roles in our lives. Now, to be clear, non-analytic naturalism and non-naturalism can also address most of these problems that I mentioned. For instance, I think non-analytic naturalism can offer similar answers to the open question argument and the just too different argument, without necessarily adopting expressivism. But I want to move on to the problems that I am working on these days, where I believe quasi-naturalism has a clear advantage over non-naturalism and non-analytic naturalism. I want to focus on two epistemological challenges to realism: the evolutionary debunking argument, developed most prominently by Sharon Street, and the reliability challenge. The evolutionary debunking argument aims to show that evolutionary facts undermine any justification we might have had for normative beliefs realistically construed. It is unlikely that our beliefs about objective normative facts are true, the argument goes, given that these beliefs are influenced by evolutionary processes that were indifferent to normative truths. The reliability challenge, which is inspired by the Benasera field challenge to mathematical Platonism, is the demand to explain how it is that our beliefs are by and large true. If realists cannot offer a good explanation of our reliability, or at least show that such an explanation is in principle available, then this makes realism implausible, or so the argument goes. A common response to these challenges on behalf of non-naturalist realism goes as follows. Evolution has endowed us with certain basic evaluative tendencies, like valuing reciprocity, which happen to align with objective normative truths, like the truth that reciprocity is good. This alignment between our basic normative attitudes and the normative truths is supposed to provide the starting point for a good explanation of our reliability, and also to show that evolutionary history does not undermine the justification of normative beliefs, even if normative facts do not causally explain our beliefs. However, this response arguably begs the question against the evolutionary debunker, because it appeals to normative commitments like our belief that reciprocity is good, whose justification is undercut by the fact that they are influenced by evolutionary factors indifferent to normative truths. There is also a problem with this response when it comes to the reliability challenge. Some people, like Justin Clark Doane, have argued that this kind of realist response shows that our normative beliefs are sensitive to the facts and safe. Sensitivity means that if the normative facts had been different, our beliefs would still have been true. Clark Doane argues that this feature is trivially ensured by the metaphysical necessity of normative facts. Because the normative facts couldn't have been different, the relevant counterfactuals are trivially true, like any counterfactuals with impossible antecedents. Safety means that our beliefs couldn't have easily been false. Clark Doane argues that this follows precisely from the evolutionary explanation of our normative attitudes. Evolutionary forces are stable and will lead to similar results in nearby worlds, so we couldn't have easily had different normative attitudes. Now, even if Clark Doane is right about all this and the non-naturalist response vindicates the modal security of our beliefs, this kind of response still arguably fails to fully explain our reliability. This is because it treats some key connections between our normative attitudes and the normative truths as brute facts, like the connection between our valuing reciprocity and the fact that reciprocity is good. And this absence of an explanatory connection between our beliefs and the facts is epistemically bad in itself. Naturalist realists seem better placed to address these epistemological challenges. If normative properties are nothing over and above certain natural properties with which we causally interact, like the property of promoting social cohesion, then the realists can offer a deep Darwinian vindication of our normative beliefs, according to which our basic evaluative tendencies were selected because they track normative facts. For example, human beings developed a tendency to value reciprocity because reciprocity is good, where to be good just is to promote social cohesion. I call this a hard naturalist response to the two epistemological challenges, and David Cobb's view would be an example of this. This naturalist response fully addresses the reliability challenge, because it provides the explanatory link between normative facts and our normative attitudes that was missing from the non-naturalist story. Also, this response does not beg the question against the evolutionary debunker. It does rely on substantive normative claims, like the claim that reciprocity is good, but this is fine given that it also reveals why evolutionary history is not an undercutting defeater for these beliefs. We believe that reciprocity is good, the naturalist says, because evolution helped us track the fact that reciprocity is good. However, hard naturalism runs into a different problem which can be stated as a dilemma. Either the hard naturalist response will have objectionable normative consequences, or it will rely on an implausibly narrow picture of the range of evolutionary paths for our species. Now let me explain each horn. For the first horn, think of a world in which sacrificing innocence in certain circumstances actually promoted social cohesion, and for this reason evolution led human beings to be permissive of sacrificing innocence in both circumstances. The hard naturalist view seems to entail that in such a world it would be good or morally permissible to sacrifice innocence, which seems unacceptable. Now, the hard naturalist might reply that evolution could never have led us to have such abhorrent normative attitudes. But this claim that such evolutionary scenarios are not possible seems ad hoc and implausible. So this is the second horn of the dilemma for hard naturalism. Now let me sketch the quasi-naturalist response to the two epistemological challenges, which I believe preserves the advantages of hard naturalism while avoiding its pitfalls. Like hard naturalists, quasi-naturalists also hold that normative properties are natural properties, so they allow for causal explanations involving normative properties, including causal explanations of beliefs. In particular, focusing on our actual evolutionary pathway, quasi-naturalists hold that we have the basic normative attitudes that we do, partly because we interacted with normative properties, that is, with the natural properties that constitute rightness, goodness, and so on. So quasi-naturalists can explain the reliability of our normative beliefs in a way that does not beg the question against the evolutionary debunker. and without relying on brute connections between our psychology and the normative facts. Nevertheless, quasi-naturalists reject the deep Darwinian vindication of normative thought and the related view that normative properties are identical with properties that played a central role in our evolutionary history, like the property of promoting social cohesion. In other words, they do not claim that our basic normative attitudes were selected because they are truth conducive, in contrast to hard naturalists. For this reason, quasi-naturalism avoids the problems faced by hard naturalism. It does not entail any objectionable claims about what would have constituted rightness or goodness in other evolutionary scenarios, while allowing that evolution could indeed have led us to have very different and even abhorrent evaluative attitudes. I know that this is very quick and raises a lot of questions, but again, this is just an overview of my arguments on epistemological challenges. Now let me move on to meta-semantic challenges. And here I want to talk about one challenge, the problem of alternative normative concepts, which was developed by Matti Eklund in his recent book Choosing Normative Concepts. But I should say that I believe quasi-naturalism has good answers to other metasemantic challenges too, like the moral twin earth problem. So here's the problem of alternative normative concepts. The following scenario seems possible. A community uses normative concepts that play the same role in guiding individual actions and shaping social life as our normative concepts, and yet refer to something else. As Eklund argues, this apparent possibility poses a problem for any normative realist who aspires to vindicate the thought that reality itself favors certain ways of valuing and acting. How can realists make good on this idea given that anything they might say in support of the privileged status of our normative concepts can be mirrored by the imagined community as well? For instance, the realist might claim that using our normative concepts is what we ought to do if we are to describe normative facts correctly. But members of the other community can make similar true claims about their normative concepts, using their own concept of ought. And this problem affects any realist view that seems to allow for concepts with the same normative role and different extensions, from naturalist theories that adopt a causal theory of reference for normative terms to standard versions of non-naturalist realism. A promising approach to this challenge is to rule out the possibility of alternative normative concepts in the first place, by arguing that any concepts that have the same normative role must share a reference as well. Eklund calls this referential normativity. But this is only the outline of a solution to the problem. The realist still needs to provide a meta-semantic picture that supports referential normativity. And this is where quasi-naturalism comes in. Expressivism allows quasi-naturalists to say that if two concepts have the same normative role, that is, if they help convey the same desire-like attitudes and have the same social function, then they are the same concept, even if they are otherwise used in vastly different ways. In other words, sameness of normative role entails sameness of concepts. I call this conceptual normativity to distinguish it from referential normativity. Now, for authoritatively normative concepts, like wrong or the all things considered ought, substantive normative inquiry will also lead us to verdicts of sameness of reference. For instance, to the judgment that wrong refers to the same natural property for us and no moral twin earth, where this is understood as a first-order normative judgment. But this need not apply to all normative concepts. For instance, taste predicates might be conceptually normative without being referentially normative. So, to sum up, quasi-naturalists can address Eklund's challenge by appealing to conceptual normativity and to first-order normative arguments to the effect that the relevant concepts do have the same reference for different communities, even if they are used in vastly different ways. This has been an overview of my project on normative quasi-naturalism and its virtues. Thanks for watching.